am unfortunately invoking an entity, an organization, a group of people who met, and I don't mean to. What I
Mhm.
mean to say is that Game B has become a label for a category of thought. If you
Mhm.
take all of those of us who are part of the living cohort of humanity, some small number of us have recognized that actually you don't need to understand with precision where we are headed to recognize that the trajectory itself will be fatal short term, and that requires some architecture to find our way out.
Mhm.
I would add, evolutionarily, that we're very good, humans are, at figuring out what to do in circumstances where our ancestral wisdom has come apart, but that our modern version of this puzzle is unlike any past version in the sense that the tools we would typically bring to bear to figure out what to do next won't work. We cannot evolve our way out of this situation by having certain groups uh, go extinct in the attempt to discover a way out and just figuring, working from whatever subset functions. In some sense, humanity is all in it together this time. And so your book,
Yeah.
I read, is a very deliberate attempt to describe what I would say, you tell me if you differ, but to describe a crisis that we have
Mhm.
found ourselves in, and to map, as you say, an open source architecture for basically bootstrapping our way out. And um,
Yeah.
is that fair?
Yeah, and I mean, and to be very clear, right? There's a thousand things wrong, screwy, scary, consequential that are happening. And I just chose to focus on what felt like an under discussed and an underdeveloped missing link in that discussion of our meta crisis, which was, that everything is going exponential for good and bad, except for meaning, except for our ability to make sense and then decide what to do about it. And that, to your game A, game B notion, I mean, if we take everything that's kind of we've been living and is in the historic record as game A, I think you could actually tease that apart even and say that there's, meaning 1.0, which is almost all of human civilization and history up until really even sort of the last century. You can timestamp it back to the French Enlightenment, whatever, but like up until super, super recently, meaning 1.0 was almost always analogous or synonymous with organized religion and communities of practice. And obviously, we have seen the erosion of that. And that starts with things like the rational, empirical, scientific revolution, French Enlightenment, Nietzsche's God is Dead, but also more recently, Pew Research Foundation finding the collapse of allegiance and affiliation. Less than 50% of Americans now, for the first time ever, don't align or orient to any kind of institutional community of practice or faith. The nuns, the NONEs, are the fastest and largest growing denomination in America. You're like, wow, okay, that's novel. And then throw in Catholic Church scandals, the erosion of trust, everything. So you could just say that edifice is collapsing. And at the same time, meaning 2.0, which you could make the case is sort of modern liberalism, right? Again, the sort of, democracy, inalienable rights of citizens, civil rights, market-based economics, that whole bundled package. That's, lately sometimes called sort of late stage capitalism. Well, clearly the last year, the last 4 or 5 years has really been eroding our trust and faith in those institutions as well. And meaning 1.0 was it offered the promise of salvation, but at the cost of exclusion. Like if you believed you were saved and if you didn't, you were damned, more or less, kind of around the world, right? If you were among the elect, you got in to the good life. And modern liberalism, coming out of the religious wars of Europe, through the Middle Ages to the Enlightenment, was like, whoa, okay, we need to that way lies ruin and bloodshed. So we're going to try something else. We're going to offer inclusion, right? All men and women are created, are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, regardless of race, color, or creed, right? Wonderful notion, partial execution, but that was the reverse promise. Instead of offering salvation at the price of inclusion, it offered inclusion at the price of salvation, separation of church and state, God is dead, and no one's going to tell you what it means. So the question for kind of the game B move is what does meaning 3.0 look like? Because we're clearly in a meaning crisis, and the absence of those two pillars has created this hollowed out vacuum in the middle. And rather than us all sort of doing what Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and young Sam Harris might have said as the new atheists, like God is dead, get rid of superstitious straw men and angry sky gods, stand on our own 2 feet and become rational materialists and do the secular humanist thing better. We're not seeing that. Right? We're seeing this, in that vacuum, we're seeing people getting shunted to extremes of fundamentalism. And that can be doubling down on traditional fixed religious beliefs, but it can also be scientific fundamentalism. It can be ideologies. It can be anything with extreme certainties of worldview and sort of Manichaean good and bads. Or if you're not bought into one of those, then nihilism. None of this matters, burn it all down, diseases of despair, addiction, depression, suicide. So the question is how do we rebuild, how do we pop the long pole back in the tent that can shelter us and provide community and weather the storm with meaning 3.0, which would be, can we do both? Can we take the best of both? Can we create inclusive salvation? Is that actually a thing we can even hope for? And then how would we do that in a decentralized, open source way so that we're not just replacing one ism with the next one?
Yeah. In a sense, I'm wondering if it's fair to say that we are in a meaning recession. I mean, almost literally. That in effect, we had achieved a kind of meaning. The scientific materialism has been marvelously productive in describing a great many things that are true and useful enough to build with, but it has actually created the crisis as well. And that what I'm seeing and what you describe, I think you memorably say early in your book, that it's a moment at which you would expect us to be at our best, but we are at our worst. I'm sure I'm just paraphrasing there, but
yeah.
I see this as well, and I'm almost stunned by the degree to which every counterintuitive thing of value is being uninvented. Right? We are losing confidence in many of the most important innovations that we've made, and it's resulting in a kind of it's like the worst of both worlds. Not only is it faith-based and metaphorical, right? Meaning that you cannot infer from it directly, but it also has not stood the test of time. And so what we're getting are beliefs that sound good, are very frequently wrong, and are unfalsifiable by virtue of the fact that we have thrown out the good part of the scientific materialism, which was the robustness of our ability to test what's true.
Yeah, and to your point about sort of right when we should be at our best, and this happened this time last year, right, with the dawning realization of a global pandemic. There was a number, everyone was kind of looking for reference points, and certainly FDR, Churchill, World War II became a familiar theme. Like, okay, it's one of those. Is it really one of those? I think it might be. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And Churchill's, never, ever, ever give up, and victory gardens, and keep calm and carry on. We kind of got ready to do that. And I think people were ready for some leadership to potentially ring that bell and get us in line. We were kind of digging back into our cultural memory of like, okay, I think it's one of these times. And instead we ended up with the most batshit upside down factionalism, schizoid denialism, and just we warped. And I mean, if this was our dry run, we just failed badly, and my sense is that, and yours and Heather's work directly informed and inspired my thinking on this, which is where you had made the case probably a couple of years ago now, of, hey folks, be careful. Like, if we either are required to step into a global perspective, or we're going to regress under stress, and we're going to go back to tribalism of any stripe. It could be ethno-tribalism, but it could be ideological tribalism, and especially the internet, you can find your corner and your pocket and your people, no matter how wacky, right? And you made the case of like, hey, be really careful, friends and neighbors, if you play the tribal identity card, because it's so deeply ingrained in our biological, social, tribal primate structuring. And you look at the neurochemistry of belonging. Molly Crockett, who was at Oxford and she's now at Yale, has done some really neat work on that. She's studied everything from positive versions of tribalism, like the Burning Man experience, to negative versions like political rallies and those kind of things. And and it's when we experience an erosion of certainty, trust, and status, our dopamine and serotonin levels plummet. We start becoming less altruistic, more prone to being edgy or to lash out. When we get together in groups, our dopamine levels spike, but that actually creates a decline in hyper altruism. So we basically, it's like somebody being coked up at a party. You basically just become a self-absorbed asshole, and then the super spooky and sometimes counterintuitive one for people is the role of oxytocin, and that in pop culture it always gets the moniker of like the cuddle drug or the trust hormone or the love hormone, and you're like, well, it's also the curb stomp your neighbor. It's the ethnocentric tribal, like, yes, it bonds mother to child and lover to lover and owner to pet, to dog, and those kind of like all those groovy things, but it also massively increases the likelihood of you being willing and wanting to other the other with extreme prejudice. And so, this sort of like tribalism is destiny and humanism is optional. And to me, that's a conversation that I'm not sure we're having with enough urgency, because we see the extremes on both the left and the right, and they would swear that they are enemies of each other. But if you pop up a level and you're like, well, what's actually going on, and what are their truth claims, and what are they trying to bring about? In most instances, it is a dismantling of the current system, which holds, and again, however idealistic, however partially delivered upon, it has nonetheless been the ideals we've rallied around in times of crisis, from the the battlefield of Gettysburg to, and Lincoln, to the rubble of 9/11 and George Bush, to Obama and the Charlottesville shootings. Like time and again, we've been like, okay, to Martin Luther King, in Washington in '63, we've been like, hey, there's this beautiful thought experiment, the infinite game, right? Let's include everybody in it, and let's have this humanistic project. And at the times of crisis, we've dusted it off and we've recommitted to it. But there's been a shift. There's been a seismic shift in the last decade, and intensifying in the last 5, and then again in this last one, of, nah, fuck it. We're breaking that treaty. We're not even pretending that we're trying to get everybody on the bus. We're blowing up the bus. And I'm sure you've come across this study. I just found it so singularly representative of this. But it was a university in Australia that studied 500 Americans across the political spectrum, including alt-right identitarians, radical social justice activists, and then somewhat sort of centrist moderates. And they assessed them against dark triad personality, so sociopathy, Machiavellianism, narcissism, and then also authoritarianism. And the moderates in the middle, who had their own belief systems but also extended the right for other people to hold theirs, so kind of just pluralism, they didn't score on any of those 4 qualities, but both sides of the far political spectrum did. So they basically were like, bad actors, regardless of what flag they're flying, increasing the factionalism. And so, if you use that James Carse notion of finite and infinite gains, which most folks are familiar with, like finite gains, win, lose, up, down, tribalism 101, and infinite game, win, win, bring as many people into the game and play the game for as long as you possibly can, right? We're actually seeing, the fact that these sworn enemies are actually on the same team. They're on team finite game. And what's at stake is that versus the infinite game. And this is what, I'm curious as to your thoughts on it, but my sense is that in our grief, in our frustration, in our rage, dissatisfaction, anger at the bill of goods that we have collectively been sold, right? There, that temptation to burn down our society, our civilization, our value sets risks destroying this tender, fragile, incredibly precious human experiment of the infinite game. And you know, the Robespierre thing, I mean, Robespierre, card carrying, you know, one of the originators of sociopaths, right? Hijacking liberty, equality, and brotherhood. That was the French Revolution was pretty badass to start with. You know, but he said, if you want to make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs. And the finite gamers, to your evolutionary thesis, all they've got to do is poke, prod, and provoke other people to other each other, including themselves. And they win. They win. It's like Darth Vader being like, strike me down, man. Just strike me down in anger and I've won. Versus the infinite game, which is like trying to put Humpty together again. It's like magnifying glasses and super glue and tweezers. It is asymmetric meme warfare, because all the finite game bad actors of any and all stripes have the second law of thermodynamics on their side, and right, and humanists don't. And I don't feel like in the discussion in the public sphere, we almost think like, may the best meme win. This is a contest of equal ideas, and it's not. It's lopsided as all get up.
Yeah, it couldn't be more lopsided. I was going to bring up entropy myself, but yes, and this, I think, goes exactly to the point I was trying to make about the space of the small number of people who have clearly seen that some game B is necessary because game B is about to blow up. Among the reasons that it's about to blow up has to do with the asymmetry in power of those who wish to take apart past gains, how the failure of recognition of how fragile what we've accomplished is, right? So to me, as an evolutionist, there is no conflict whatsoever between the observation that our society is very powerful and generates a tremendous amount of wealth, and the observation that it is almost impossibly fragile, right? Those two things are completely compatible. And so
yes, with all of our confirmation bias and heuristics that make it hard for us to wrap our head around.
Hard for us to wrap our head around. And as you point out in your book, the Pax Americana has now dominated enough generations that there's this sort of sense that things just go on this way. And that's really the exception rather than the rule. But people don't intuit it because they have no personal experience with it coming apart. I also quite resonate with your point about the last year having been a test that we have failed spectacularly, and that is an indication of just how urgent it is that we start thinking differently about solution making. All of it does, however, make me want to address something which I know is there because the last time I saw you in person, which I guess would have been in Austin, where you live, am I right?
Yeah.
In Austin in 2018 would it have been? Well,
could have been, yeah.
In any case,
we had that nice lunch.
Yes, we had that nice lunch, and it began to dawn on me that you and I are on parallel missions because of exactly the recognition that we were just talking about. I think we're built of very compatible but very different stuff in some ways, and it occurred to me in talking to you how can I put this? How deeply troubled you are by humanity's predicament, right? And I felt that looking at your book as well, right? I think, there's a part of me, and you tell me if I'm projecting something onto you that isn't there, but there's a story that people need to understand in order to figure out what it is we have to do and what sorts of tools would have to be brought to bear for it to work. And then there's also this watching the clock run out, right? And these two things are in conflict. Can people be